So let's output the resources here. And for that, we could use a list item with v4 on it, of course, to loop through all the stored resources. But as I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, I rather create a separate component which contains the list item and then output all the data in there. Now you might wonder why. Why would we create a separate component instead of just writing all the markup here? Well, first of all, let me be very clear. You don't need to create a separate component. It's optional. It's just the idea behind using frameworks like Vue. If you build bigger and bigger applications, you could theoretically put all the markup into just one Vue component. All the markup could go into the template of app.vue. But this would become a super huge file, and maintaining it, editing it, finding the code you want to edit right now, that would all become a nightmare if you have all the markup, all the logic in one file. And that's why we want to split our code into small, reusable pieces. Now, there is no hard rule when you should go for a new component versus putting the markup and logic into an existing component. It's something you will develop over time. It's a feeling you will get, and it also comes down to personal preference, of course. But things like list items through which you loop are typical candidates for separate components, and therefore I'll create a brand new component here as well. And that component, which I want to generate here, is the resource item component. Now the name is up to you, but of course you want to describe what you will use this component for. And I will use this component to show a learning resource item. Of course, we could therefore also name it learning resource if you prefer that. And actually, I do prefer that. So let's maybe go with that. Learning resource.vue. Now, just because I named the file like this, it's not automatically the name by which I will use the component, but it is considered a good practice to keep that aligned. So if you name the file learning resource, you should also name the component learning resource later. Now, I don't want to store this component in the components folder like this though. We're going to add more components later, and to keep my code organized and keep the files organized, I'll create a subfolder here. And I'll name it resources or learning-resources because I want to store all the learning resource related components in that subfolder. So inside of components, and they're in the learning resources folder. And then in app.vue, I want to import this newly created component. It's still empty, but we're going to change this soon. So let's import the learning resource from ./components/learning resources/learning resource.vue. That's the file we just created. And with that import added here in app.vue, we can add the components option to our object and register learning resource like this. This is how you learned it. You could also give it another key separately or the same key, which will be assumed anyways, but there is no need to do so. You can just register it like this, and thanks to this modern JavaScript syntax, this is automatically expanded to this code, and that in turn will then tell Vue that you want to be able to use the learning resource component by using this tag or the kebab case version of it. But that's all something I covered in the last modules. So now we got the learning resource imported, and now here I will output learning resource, and I'm a fan of this kebab case for my elements, so I will use it. And I will output it here, but of course not just once, but instead with v4 I will loop through my stored resources and create one learning resource component instance per item in my stored resources. So in this case we have 2 stored resources, and that simply means that we're going to create 2 learning resource instances with v4. For that, we can loop through the stored resources like this with res in stored resources. And we should bind the key prop here, which Vue wants. In this case to res.id, because every resource, which I extract into the res variable here, has an ID field. And that ID is guaranteed to be unique, so it's a perfect key. With that, we're going to create multiple learning resources, and that means that we can now go back to the learning resource.view file and add a template there, because ultimately we want to be able to output something there. So in this template, I will now output a list item, opening and closing tags, and inside of the list item, I want to have my content. And here indeed, I want to have a div inside of that, which then in turn holds a header. And in that header, I want to have a href tag, which outputs the title later. And next to that, so in the same row, you could say, I want to have a button which allows us to delete this. Now, as a side note, I'm aware that I challenged you to go ahead and create your own component with a list item, and I'm fully aware that you probably did not create this markup. And that's fine. You can now create it together with me. I just wanted you to also practice creating and registering and using components on your own. And you hopefully did that, and you hopefully succeeded there. If not, we're doing it together now. So we get the header, we get the href tag, we get the button, and it's all in that div. Below that div, I want to have a paragraph. That's where the description should be output later. And below that, I'll add a nav element, which is a default HTML element, in which I then want to have an anchor tag, which should lead to the link the user provided. So here we could have a text of view resource, and the link value, well, that's something I want to set to the link value stored in the respective resources. So you can already tell that the learning resource component needs external data in order to work correctly. Because we got all the markup here, but the title is missing, the description is missing, and the link is missing. And how do we get this external data? How do we make this component reusable and configurable? With props, of course. So here we can now add our script tag, like this, and then add the props option to let Vue know about the props we want to get in this component. And the simplest form here is to provide an array where every prop is registered as a string. So we could, for example, expect to get a title prop. You can also use the longer form and be more specific about the prop you want to get, and describe the type of data you want to get there, describe whether it's required or not. But I will keep things simple here and just use this array. So we'll get a title. I will also need a description, and I also want a link. Now, all these names here are 100% up to you. It's probably best if you use the same names as I do in order to follow along with ease, but you can use any names you want here. It's your component, so you can name the props however you want. Now, with that, we can now output the prop data here. For example, here in the href tag, we can output the title. So this prop. In the paragraph, I want to output the description. So here we can interpolate description. And you learned that all the props here, so these props, are available just like this in a template. They are available as if they would be data registered in the data option of this component. We can then also bind ref here with vbind, or the shorthand, which I'm using here, and bind this to link, so to the value in the link prop. And now the missing piece, of course, is that we actually do provide the props here, so that we ensure that values are passed in for all those props. So let's go back to app.vue, and here, where we are using learning resource, and where we are using v4, we now want to bind all those props and provide values for all the props of learning resource. So we want to set a value for the title prop, for example. And of course, that value should not be hard-coded, but dynamic, because it depends on res. So here, I'm binding title to res.title. And the same for the description, which should be bound to res.description. And I'm reformatting this to make it easier to read. and bind the link to res.link. And with that, we're feeding in values for these three props, title, description, and link, which we are expecting on the learning resource. And now we can also try and see it on the screen. For that, in main.js, I will now import app from /app.view and pass that here to create app. And in app.view, I'm already registering learning resource. So if we save it all, we should see this on the screen. Definitely not beautiful, but it shows that this works and that our own component is working. Now let's work on some styling next.